Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Quarantine Kitchen. Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about knife maintenance and care. I just wanted to show you how I like to care for my knives, and today I'll be using one of my good friend's knives and just showing you kind of some basic sharpening. The reason I'm using this knife is because it's probably closer to what people have at home. I have some Japanese knives, and while I think they're great and they're what I prefer to use, most people don't have them at home, considering that they're often quite expensive. So I'll start by detailing kind of the tools that I have here today. First, I just have a little stone holder, and then I have what is called a lapping plate, and this is a 100 grit diamond micron plate, and so it's just basically a piece of steel with a rough side. Next, I have a 400 grit whetstone. This is a nanowa stone. I like this one for putting on basically a new edge. This is a pretty rough stone and cuts steel pretty quickly. Next, I have a 1000 grit stone. This is also a nanowa stone, and all of these are basically a composite material pressed into stone. None of these are kind of a natural stone. And my final stone that I'll be using today is a 2000 grit stone. This is about as high as I'll take home knives, especially ones kind of made out of stainless steel, which this is. This doesn't tell me what grade of steel this is, but just feeling it, already I know that it's stainless steel, judging on its make. And because of that, I really want to not take it too high because it really won't hold an edge after too high of a grit. So whenever I'm sharpening, I start by just getting a nice base in my stone holder. I have a wet towel here that's just going to hold it down. Most of these stones, in fact all of them, are splash and go stones, which means that I don't really need to soak them. These lower grit ones I might soak for maybe 30 seconds, but in general, I don't need to. And they kind of just get them wet and ready to go. So I'm going to start by flattening my 400 grit stone. I'm going to get it a little bit wet, place it in my stone holder, and then using my 100 grit diamond lapping plate, I'm just gonna flatten this stone. I can tell it's not flat, and you can too just by looking. Here is basically where this stone is touching. Right here isn't getting rubbed away, so that's where I've kind of created a divot. It's good to keep your stones flat so that you can get an even stroke with your knife. I don't do this every time. I just haven't done it in a while on this stone, so it's got a decent sized divot. Once that's pretty flat, I add just a little bit more water, and this one's pretty much ready to go. It's not necessary to wipe any of that grit off. In fact, that's called a mud or a slurry, and it's gonna help when sharpening the stone. That's actually gonna do our polishing and cutting. So, the next really big step to do is kind of pick the angle that you're going to be sharpening at. When I sharpen, I tend to, depends on the knife and the makeup of the steel. When I sharpen my knives, because they're a sort of harder Japanese steel, I go at a much steeper or acute angle. With this softer steel, kind of German stainless steel, I'm gonna actually keep it probably at about 22.5 degrees. This is a nice angle for a softer home kitchen knife because it's basically wide enough that it's sturdy, but it's thin enough that you can get through almost any vegetable. And vegetables are going to be the hardest thing to cut, believe it or not. So basically, once I've found my angle, which here again is about 22.5, I'm just going to evenly and carefully go back and forth on my stone, polishing that edge. I really want to make sure to go back and forth all the way up the blade, back and forth, and really try and keep that even. You'll notice that a really good mud and slurry has started to develop. You'll notice it's a little bit darker. That's because some of the steel from the knife is now coming onto the stone. So now that I've sort of started to do that side, basically what you're looking for is to develop a burr, which basically means that the steel has rolled over onto this side. So I've kind of created a burr all the way down this edge, and so I'm going to flip over my knife, rotate my stone a little just for ease of use, and start doing the same thing on the other side. Again, finding my angle at about 22.5. Again, this is really just a guess. Obviously, I can't perfectly measure this just by looking at it, but it's a approximation, and as long as I keep this angle the same on both sides, then it won't really matter the exact number as long as it's the same. Throughout sharpening, you might want to add a little bit more water just to keep this mud from getting too dry. We don't need tons, otherwise we're going to start to wash that away. From here, we're essentially going back and forth, creating a good burr on both sides until it really starts to feel sharp along the edge. You can kind of test sharpness by whether or not it bites and grips into your fingernail. If it slides off, then we're not quite at an edge yet. So from here, now that I've kind of developed a burr back and forth and it's starting to catch into my fingernail, though it's not quite there, I'm going to do basically some whole edge strokes. And I'm going to start with probably 4 or 5 per side. And so what I mean by whole edge strokes is starting at the tip and going all the way down to the bottom of the edge. And then coming back the other direction, still along the whole edge. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And then, now that I've done 5, I'm going to start counting down, basically. So I've done 5, and now I'll move on to 4, and then 3, and so on. All right, now that we've got a decent edge using our 400 grit stone, we're gonna kind of move on to the next stone, which is gonna be our 1000 grit. Something important to remember is that the edge you get on your lowest stone is gonna be, basically determines how sharp you can get your knife. If your knife is not sharp after your first grit stone, then it will never get as sharp as it can get using the other stones. So moving on to our 1000 grit stone. Again, this is just a splash and go stone, a little bit of water on there. And we'll start developing a mud with a knife. When doing this, I'm basically going to do the exact same process I already did with the 400 grit stone. Something I didn't mention earlier, but something that's really important, is to actually make sure that when you're doing the tip of the knife, because the curve of the blade has changed, you're really going to want to lift up with the handle of the knife. That's really going to bring the tip of the knife into the correct angle and contact with your stone. If you leave it flat, your tip of your knife is not actually going to touch anything. So again, that's just lifting the heel to make sure that the tip of your knife is touching the stone. All right, here again, we're gonna clean off our knife, check out the edge, and see if we're ready to move on to our final stone. So this is definitely easily catching into my fingernail. And there doesn't seem to be a burr anywhere when I feel it pushing kind of against the edge. Maybe a little one right there, so we might do one more little sort of edge leading stroke. Yeah. All right, now we're going to move on to our 2000 grit stone. So the 2000 grit is considered a polishing stone in this case, and basically what it's going to do is kind of give us that nice, closer to mirror edge that looks really good and is really good for cutting kind of softer fruits and vegetables, something like a tomato. Again, we're basically going to do all the exact same steps using this stone. You'll notice, because it is a finer stone, that it actually sounds a lot quieter because it's scraping a little bit less. All right, we've kind of done our final little process. It's sticking easily into my fingernail now, not slipping anywhere. And if I feel lightly along the edge, I don't feel any burr. If at this point you do feel like a very small burr, what you can do is grab a wine cork or any other cork that you might have and just draw the knife edge right through it. This is going to actually deburr or straighten out that edge just a little bit. So now we've kind of got a nice little edge on this. If you look really closely, you can see that the edge, there we go, is a little bit shinier and more polished than the rest of the blade. It's a little bit more visible towards the tip. Let's see, there we go. And so this knife should be good to go. I've only taken it to 2000 grit because, again, this is a knife used for home use, and you know, no one's going to be filleting any sushi or anything like that with this today. So we don't really need it any farther than about 2000 grit.